What would happen if one of the most decorated generals in American military history stood before the world and spoke words so explosive that his own government tried to erase them from the record? What if those words challenged everything the Allied powers had just fought for, threatened to ignite a new global conflict, and forced the military establishment to choose between truth and political survival? In the autumn of 1945, as victory celebrations echoed across Europe and the world believed the nightmare of war had finally ended, General George S. Patton Jr. sat in his headquarters in Bavaria and said things that would cost him everything. His statements about the defeated Germans, about the Soviet allies, and about the occupation policies being enforced across the shattered landscape of Europe were so controversial, so politically dangerous, that within weeks he would be stripped of his command, silenced by the very leaders who had once praised his genius, and within months he would be dead under circumstances that remain questioned to this day. This is not a story about battlefield heroics or military strategy, but about what happens when a warrior refuses to become a politician, when inconvenient truths collide with official narratives, and when speaking your mind in uniform becomes an act of career suicide. What Patton said in those final months of 1945 would haunt the Allied leadership, vindicate some of his warnings within years, and leave historians debating whether he was a reckless fool or a prophet silenced before his time. If you've never heard the full story of what George Patton actually said and why it terrified the political establishment so much that they had to remove him from power, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now because we're about to reveal historical truths that textbooks often skip over. Hit that like button if you believe that even uncomfortable history deserves to be told honestly, share this video with anyone who thinks they know the real story of World War II's aftermath, and leave a comment telling us what fact about Patton's final days surprised you most, because this story will change how you understand the post-war period forever. Now let's go back to May 1945, when the guns finally fell silent across Europe, when the concentration camps had been liberated and their horrors exposed to the world, when Nazi Germany lay in ruins and the Allied powers stood triumphant over the wreckage of Hitler's thousand-year Reich that had lasted only 12 years. George Smith Patton Jr. was at the height of his fame, a household name across America, the hard-charging commander of the Third Army who had raced across France, relieved Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and driven deep into Germany with a speed and ferocity that had made him a legend. His pearl-handled revolvers, his profane speeches, his absolute confidence in his own military genius, and his belief that he was the reincarnation of ancient warriors had made him both beloved by his troops and feared by his enemies. But as the shooting war ended and the occupation began, Patton found himself in a role he was temperamentally unsuited for, governing a defeated population, implementing denazification policies, and working alongside Soviet forces whose intentions he deeply distrusted. The transformation from warrior to administrator, from combat commander to political officer, was one that Patton neither wanted nor handled well, and within months his frustration would boil over into statements that would shock the world. By July 1945, Patton was serving as the military governor of Bavaria, responsible for administering a region devastated by years of war, filled with displaced persons, former Nazi party members, and a civilian population struggling to survive amid the ruins. The official policy handed down from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was strict denazification, the removal of anyone who had been a member of the Nazi Party from positions of authority or public service. On paper this seemed straightforward and morally necessary, but in practice Patton found it impossibly complicated because in Nazi Germany, party membership had often been mandatory for anyone who wanted to work in government, education, utilities, or almost any professional field. Patton began to argue, first in private and then increasingly in public, that this blanket policy was preventing the occupation from functioning effectively because they couldn't find enough qualified non-Nazis to run the water systems, the electrical grids, the rail networks, or the administrative bureaucracies needed to keep millions of people alive through the coming winter. He started making exceptions, appointing former Nazi party members to technical positions, and when questioned about this by his superiors and by the press, he gave answers that would ignite a firestorm. In September 1945, at a press conference in Regensburg, Patton made a statement that would be reported around the world and would seal his fate. He compared Nazi party membership to being a Republican or Democrat in America, suggesting that most Germans had joined simply for practical reasons without really believing in the ideology. The reaction was immediate and explosive, with newspapers across the United States and Britain condemning Patton's remarks as insensitive, tone-deaf, and offensive to the millions who had died fighting Nazi ideology. Jewish organizations, veteran groups, and political leaders expressed outrage that a senior American general would minimize Nazi party membership just months after the liberation of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau. Eisenhower, who was Patton's friend and had protected him through previous controversies including the infamous slapping incidents in Sicily, found himself under immense political pressure to act, pressure coming from Washington, from the press, from public opinion, and from the need to maintain the moral authority of the occupation. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower summoned Patton to his headquarters in Frankfurt and delivered the news in person. Patton was being relieved of command of the Third Army and reassigned to lead the 15th Army, a paper command tasked with writing the official history of the war in Europe. For a man like Patton, who lived for action and command, who believed his destiny was to lead armies in battle, this reassignment was effectively a forced retirement, a public humiliation, and a clear signal that his career was over. But what many people don't realize is that Patton's comments about denazification, while they triggered his removal, were not the only controversial things he had been saying, nor were they necessarily the statements that most worried the Allied leadership. Behind closed doors, in private meetings, and in his personal diary, Patton had been saying something far more inflammatory, something that if widely known might have torn apart the Allied coalition even as victory was being celebrated. Throughout the summer and fall of 1945, Patton had been expressing increasingly hostile views about the Soviet Union and increasingly sympathetic views about the German military, not about Nazi ideology but about German soldiers and their capability as fighting men. In private conversations with his staff, in letters to his wife Beatrice, and in his diary entries, Patton argued that the United States had defeated the wrong enemy, that the real threat to Western civilization was Soviet communism, not German nationalism, and that instead of disarming the Germans, the Allies should be rearming them to fight alongside America against the Russians. These were not offhand remarks or momentary frustrations. They represented Patton's genuine strategic assessment based on what he was seeing in occupied Germany, where Soviet behavior in the eastern zones was already showing signs of what would become the Cold War. Patton watched as the Soviets stripped entire factories from their zone and shipped them back to Russia, as they installed communist governments in the territories they controlled, as they refused to cooperate with Western allies on basic occupation policies, and as they began treating their former allies with suspicion and hostility. What Patton was seeing and saying in 1945, that the Soviet Union would become America's next great enemy and that cooperation with Stalin was naive and dangerous, would prove largely correct within just a few years. But in the autumn of 1945 such statements were politically impossible because the official narrative was that the Soviets were brave allies who had sacrificed millions to defeat Hitler. The tension between what Patton believed and what he was allowed to say created an impossible situation, and his frustration manifested in increasingly reckless statements to anyone who would listen. On May 7, 1945, the day before the official German surrender, Patton had written in his diary that the United States should go to Berlin and push the Soviets back to where they belonged, and he later told his staff officers that he could reach Moscow before the Soviets could reinforce, a statement that was both militarily absurd and politically catastrophic if it ever became public. During meetings with other American commanders, Patton argued that the policy of unconditional surrender had been a mistake, that the Allies should have negotiated a separate peace with Germany and then joined forces with the Wehrmacht to drive the Soviets out of Eastern Europe. He told Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson in May 1945 that we promised the Europeans freedom and it would be worse than ever before, predicting that Soviet domination of Eastern Europe would be as brutal as Nazi occupation. These conversations were reported back to Washington, where they caused deep concern among political and military leaders who feared that Patton might say something publicly that would destroy the carefully maintained fiction of Allied unity. The denazification comments in September simply provided the politically acceptable excuse to remove a general who had become a loose cannon, whose views on the Soviets were dangerous to official policy, and whose lack of political discipline made him a liability in the New World Order being constructed at Potsdam, Yalta, and in the halls of the United Nations. What made Patton's situation even more complex was that his assessment of German soldiers versus Nazi ideology was actually more nuanced than his public statement suggested, though his inability to articulate that nuance in politically acceptable ways destroyed him. Patton distinguished between the Nazi Party leadership, whom he considered criminals deserving of punishment, and the average German soldier, whom he respected as a professional warrior who had fought skillfully for a cause that Patton found abhorrent. This distinction, common among military professionals who can admire tactical competence while despising strategic objectives, was impossible to explain to a public that had spent 4 years being told that all Germans were evil and that had just discovered the full horror of the Holocaust. When Patton said that the Nazi thing is just like a Democrat-Republican election fight, he was trying to explain that low-level party membership didn't necessarily indicate ideological commitment, a point that had some validity but that was catastrophically tone-deaf given the timing and context. His failure to understand how his words would be received, his inability to recognize that what might be acceptable in a military staff meeting was unacceptable in a public statement, and his fundamental disinterest in political considerations made him incapable of surviving in the post-war environment where military administration required diplomatic skill as much as tactical genius. The very qualities that had made him a great combat commander, his aggression, his certainty, his impatience with politics, and his willingness to say exactly what he thought, made him a terrible occupation governor. We've reached the halfway point of this story, and if you're starting to understand why Patton's removal was about much more than one press conference, then show your support by subscribing to this channel, hitting the like button, sharing this video with friends who appreciate deep historical analysis, and leaving a comment about which aspect of Patton's final months you find most fascinating. Because the second half of this story gets even more controversial. After his relief from command, Patton was devastated, feeling betrayed by Eisenhower, abandoned by the army he had served for decades, and convinced that he had been punished for telling uncomfortable truths that others were too cowardly to acknowledge. In letters to his wife written in October 1945, Patton expressed his bitterness, writing that he had been crucified for stating facts and that political correctness was being valued over honest assessment. He began planning for his return to the United States, scheduled for December 1945, where he intended to speak publicly about what he had seen in Europe, about Soviet behavior, about occupation policies, and about what he believed were fundamental mistakes in how the war's aftermath was being handled. The prospect of Patton returning to America and embarking on a speaking tour, appearing before Congress, writing his memoirs, and sharing his unfiltered views with the American public terrified the military and political establishment because they knew he would say exactly what he thought regardless of consequences. The question of what Patton would have said, what revelations he might have shared, and what political impact his testimony might have had became moot on December 9, 1945, when the staff car carrying Patton and his chief of staff was involved in a collision with an army truck near Mannheim, Germany. Patton was the only person seriously injured in the low-speed accident, suffering a cervical spinal fracture that left him paralyzed from the neck down, and 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, he died from a pulmonary embolism at a military hospital in Heidelberg. The official investigation concluded that the accident was exactly that, a tragic collision caused by the truck driver making a sudden left turn, with no evidence of foul play, conspiracy, or intentional harm. However, the timing of Patton's death, just days before his scheduled return to America, combined with his controversial statements, his conflicts with Allied leadership, and his stated intention to speak publicly about Soviet behavior, has fueled conspiracy theories for decades. Some researchers have pointed to inconsistencies in the official reports, questioned why no one else was seriously injured, suggested that the Soviet NKVD had motive to silence him, or proposed that elements within the American government wanted him removed before he could create political chaos. The vast majority of historians reject these theories, finding no credible evidence of anything other than an unfortunate accident, but the theories persist because Patton's death was so convenient for those who feared what he might say. What is beyond dispute is what Patton actually did say in the months before his death, and examining those statements reveals a man who was simultaneously prophetic and problematic, ahead of his time on some issues and disastrously wrong on others. His warnings about Soviet expansionism were vindicated almost immediately, as Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in March 1946, just 3 months after Patton's death, and as the Cold War that Patton had predicted became the defining conflict of the next 45 years. The Berlin blockade of 1948, the Soviet takeover of Czechoslovakia, the establishment of communist governments throughout Eastern Europe, and the eventual construction of the Berlin Wall all proved that Patton's assessment of Soviet intentions was more accurate than the optimistic cooperation that Allied leaders were publicly proclaiming in 1945. When Patton said that we may have been fighting the wrong enemy, he was not defending Nazism, which he found repugnant, but arguing that Soviet communism posed a longer-term threat to Western civilization than a defeated Germany, an assessment that was heretical in 1945 but conventional wisdom by 1950. President Harry Truman, who had authorized friendly cooperation with Stalin in 1945, would implement the Truman Doctrine in 1947 to contain Soviet expansion, essentially adopting the confrontational approach toward Moscow that Patton had been advocating 2 years earlier. Secretary of State George Marshall, who had been among those pushing for Patton's removal, would propose the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe specifically to prevent communist expansion, again validating Patton's concern that a devastated Germany would be vulnerable to Soviet influence. However, being right about Soviet intentions did not make Patton right about everything, and his suggested solutions ranged from impractical to horrifying. His proposal to rearm German forces and immediately attack the Soviet Union in the summer of 1945 was military madness, ignoring the war weariness of Allied troops, the moral impossibility of allying with defeated Nazis, the lack of political support for a new war, and the enormous casualties that such a conflict would have caused. The American public, which had just endured 4 years of global war, would never have supported immediately starting another conflict, especially one that required treating yesterday's enemies as today's allies. Patton's dismissal of denazification, while containing valid points about the practical difficulties of implementation, showed an appalling insensitivity to the moral imperative of holding Nazis accountable and preventing their return to power. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945 just as Patton was being relieved, represented an international commitment to justice that Patton seemed willing to sacrifice for administrative convenience, a position that history has rightly rejected. His comparison of Nazi party membership to American political parties was not just politically tone-deaf but morally obtuse, failing to recognize that the Nazi Party was not a normal political organization but the administrative structure of a genocidal regime that had murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others in a systematic campaign of extermination. The real tragedy of Patton's final months was that he had legitimate concerns about Soviet behavior and occupation policies that were being dismissed because of how catastrophically he expressed them, wrapped in offensive analogies and delivered with his characteristic lack of diplomatic filter. A more politically skilled general might have raised the same strategic concerns about Soviet expansion, the same practical problems with denazification, and the same warnings about treating defeated Germany so harshly that it would become vulnerable to communist influence, but would have done so in private channels, using careful language, and building political support rather than alienating it. Patton's genius on the battlefield came from his ability to move faster than the enemy expected, to attack when conventional wisdom said to defend, and to trust his instincts over cautious planning, but those same qualities made him incapable of navigating the political landscape of post-war occupation. He could not slow down, could not moderate his language, could not recognize that different situations required different approaches, and could not accept that a warrior's directness might not serve in a diplomat's role. The military establishment that removed him was not necessarily wrong to do so, because whatever the merits of his strategic concerns, his inability to express them appropriately made him a liability in his position, but in removing him they also silenced a voice that was warning about real dangers that they were not yet ready to acknowledge. The irony is that within 18 months of Patton's death, American policy toward Germany and the Soviet Union had shifted substantially in his direction, though no one would admit that Patton had been right. The punitive approach to occupation gave way to reconstruction, as American leaders recognized that a permanently weakened Germany would create a power vacuum that the Soviets would fill, exactly what Patton had warned. Former Nazi party members were quietly rehabilitated and returned to positions in government, business, and even intelligence services, because as Patton had argued, they possessed skills and knowledge that were needed. The western zones of Germany were merged and rebuilt as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, transforming yesterday's enemy into tomorrow's ally in precisely the way that Patton had suggested, though stretched over years rather than accomplished overnight. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, established in 1949, included West Germany by 1955, creating the anti-Soviet military alliance that Patton had envisioned, though without the immediate confrontation he had advocated. None of the officials who had condemned Patton's statements in 1945 acknowledged that their policies had evolved to match his strategic assessment, and none admitted that his warnings about Soviet behavior had been prescient even if his proposed solutions had been reckless. What Patton said in those final months of 1945 was that the Allied victory over Nazi Germany had created a new and potentially more dangerous threat in the form of Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, that occupation policies needed to balance justice with practicality, that German technical expertise was needed to rebuild a functioning society, and that the West should prepare for confrontation with Moscow rather than naively hoping for cooperation. These statements, which got him relieved of command and destroyed his reputation, were controversial in 1945 but would become mainstream American foreign policy by 1950, forming the foundation of containment strategy, the Marshall Plan, NATO, and the entire structure of the Cold War. But Patton also said things that were indefensible, making offensive comparisons that minimized Nazi crimes, showing disregard for the moral dimension of denazification, and proposing military actions that were politically impossible and strategically questionable. The full picture is complex, a mixture of prophetic warnings and reckless statements, strategic insight and political tone-deafness, military genius and diplomatic disaster. History's judgment on Patton has had to balance these contradictions, acknowledging that he saw real problems that others missed while recognizing that his solutions were often worse than the problems he identified. The documents that capture what Patton actually said come from multiple sources, each revealing different aspects of his thinking in those final months.